The fluorescent lights in the records room hummed with the same low frequency that had lulled Captain Rebecca Hale into a near trance. Hours had passed. She wasn't sure how many since she'd first stepped inside Fort Liberty's dusty archival wing to gather research for her thesis on World War II field medicine. A dozen folders lay open before her on the long metal table, each one filled with yellowing pages, forgotten reports, and brittle military communiques. It was supposed to be a routine afternoon. Quiet, academic, safe. Then she opened the wrong folder. Or maybe it was the right one. The tab read, Historical Review North Africa Theater, 1942. Nothing unusual. She flipped it open with the casual efficiency of someone used to government paperwork. But the photo tucked inside stopped her cold. Her fingers froze in mid-turn. Her breath caught. Her stomach dropped, heavy and sudden like a sinking ship. A black and white image, printed on fiber-based paper, stared up at her like a ghost. A woman in a Red Cross armband. Army nurse uniform. A desert chapel in the background, crumbling but still standing, and beside her 3 men in Wehrmacht uniforms, German soldiers, one of them smiling. But Rebecca couldn't tear her eyes from the woman, because the woman in the photo wasn't just any nurse. It was her grandmother, Margaret Hale, Madge, the family disgrace, the one they never spoke of, the one who, according to a single cold Army letter from 1943, had been executed by Allied command for collaboration with the enemy. Rebecca's hands trembled as she pulled the photo closer to the light. The details sharpened under the harsh glow creases in Maggie's uniform, the chapel's broken arch behind her, the faint outline of sandbags in the corner. And then, on the back, a note in pencil. M. Halve. Contactgebel Messoutrigien. November 1942. November 1942. 3 weeks after the date, the U.S. Army claimed her grandmother was executed. Rebecca felt the room spin. She gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. "You finding what you need, Captain?" The voice from the doorway jolted her. Sergeant Dale Murphy stood with his arms crossed, casual but observant. She quickly slid the photo back into the folder. "Yeah," she said, trying to steady her voice. "Just almost done." "Fascinating stuff, huh?" He nodded toward the piles. "My uncle was with the 34th Infantry in Algeria. Said the nurses saved more lives than any of us grunts ever could." Rebecca forced a smile. They were heroes. She didn't add the bitter, silent thought. "Not all of them. Not according to my family." Murphy left with a wave and a cough. Rebecca waited until the door closed behind him, then pulled the photo out again. It was clearer than any image she'd ever seen of Maggie. Most family photos had been destroyed after the Army's letter arrived. Her father had burned them in a fury, a ritual of shame and silence. Only one portrait survived formal, posed, buried in a locked drawer. But this Maggie, she looked alive, relaxed, proud, standing beside the enemy like it didn't matter, like she didn't care what anyone thought. Rebecca knew that expression. She'd seen it in the mirror before deployment. Not arrogance, not rebellion, resolve. She raised the photo closer. The German soldiers didn't look like captors. They weren't pointing weapons or restraining her. They stood close, comfortable. One of them even had his hand on Maggie's shoulder. If this was a betrayal, it didn't look like one. It looked like a meeting, a choice. Rebecca snapped a picture of the photograph with her phone, hands still shaking. Then she returned the folder exactly where she'd found it. One last glance at the manila tab, then she walked out of the records room, her mind spinning faster than her boots could carry her. Back in her quarters, she locked the door, pulled the blinds, and cleared the table. She opened the shoebox she hadn't touched since college. Inside, buried beneath faded documents and discharge papers, was the one letter that had shaped her family for generations. "We regret to inform you that Lieutenant Margaret Hale was executed for treason after collaborating with enemy forces in the North African theater." Rebecca read it again, slowly, line by line. Each word now curdled with doubt. They said she collaborated. They said she was executed. But the photograph said otherwise. Why had Maggie been alive in November 1942? Why was she standing with German soldiers, unrestrained, unafraid, and apparently working with them? What the hell did "with contacts" mean? Rebecca grabbed a yellow legal pad and began listing everything she knew. Her grandmother had been stationed with the 23rd Field Medical Unit during Operation Torch. She'd disappeared in October. Court-martial was never publicized. Execution was conducted in secret. Her father, Maggie's only son, had never forgiven her. He'd enlisted in Vietnam, fought 2 tours, and drank himself to death before ever saying her name again. But now, that shame felt like a lie told to bury something bigger. She studied the photo again under her magnifying glass. One of the mental sharp cheekbones, light eyes looked odd, too clean. His uniform didn't fit like the others. Something about him felt wrong. And Maggie. Her expression wasn't just calm. It was intentional. She was working, not collaborating, operating. Rebecca had spent 8 years in the Army Medical Corps. She'd learned to see what others missed. Fear in the eyes, tension in the jaw, the subtle tremors of someone under duress. There was none of that in Maggie's face. There was only certainty. Rebecca pulled out her laptop and opened the Department of Defense Personnel Request System. She entered the basic details. Hale, Margaret Aw. Service years, 1941, 1942. Unit, 23rd Field Medical, North Africa. She hit submit. A few moments later, a line of red text appeared. Record classified. Sealed by military intelligence authorization required. Her heart skipped. Classified? For a nurse? Nurses didn't get classified files. Unless they weren't just nurses. She picked up the phone and called the National Archives. A woman named Janice answered. Her voice was polite, clinical. I'm sorry, Captain. Lieutenant Hale's file is under Historical Intelligence Seal. That usually indicates she was connected to an OSS operation or wartime counterintelligence. Unless you have Tier 3 clearance or congressional authorization, I can't release it. Rebecca sat in silence. Captain, Janice asked gently, do you want to file a FOIA request? What's the average response time? 6 months, maybe longer. Rebecca ended the call without answering. She stared at the wall, the clock, the photograph. She thought about her career, her reputation, the thesis she was supposed to finish, the promotion she'd been waiting for, the quiet, safe future she'd built in the shadow of a scandal she never understood. And now? Now she had proof that none of it had been true. Her grandmother hadn't been a traitor. She'd been something else entirely. The knock at the door made her jump. 3 soft taps. She froze, waited, listened. Nothing. She crept toward the peephole. Empty hallway. Her phone buzzed. No caller ID. She let it go to voicemail. Silence. Then a single message appeared. Stop digging. Rebecca's breath caught. She turned back to the photo and whispered, What did you get yourself into, Maggie? And why, after 40 years, was someone still trying to keep it buried? The room felt colder now. She knew this wasn't just a family mystery anymore. It was a conspiracy, and someone had just realized she'd uncovered it. Fort Liberty in the fall was all misted mornings and rust-colored leaves clinging to the last of summer's warmth. Soldiers marched across dewy fields while cadence calls echoed faintly through the trees. But inside Captain Rebecca Hale's apartment, time felt frozen. The photo lay on the table, backlit by the low sun, and nothing, absolutely nothing, felt like it had the day before. She hadn't slept, hadn't eaten. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her grandmother's face. Maggie Hale, the ghost that lived in the margins of her family's story, the one everyone tried to forget. But ghosts don't stay buried forever. Rebecca stared at the yellowing Army letter once more. The words had once carried the finality of a gavel, like a door slammed shut. But now they read like fiction, a fabrication dressed up in official language. Executed for treason. Collaborated with enemy forces. No military honors. It felt rehearsed, sanitized. There had never been a trial. No court-martial records. No transcript. Just silence. Just shame. Her father, Marcus Hale, had lived his whole life beneath that shadow. He'd been 7 when the letter arrived. Rebecca could still remember how his voice changed when Maggie's name came up, if it ever did. Tight. Controlled. Like he was pressing back decades of questions with sheer force of will. He never spoke of her service. Never kept photos. The one surviving portrait had been tucked in the back of his desk drawer like a dangerous artifact, something you didn't touch unless you wanted to get burned. He joined the Marines at 18. 2 tours in Vietnam. Bronze Star. But no ceremony could scrub the betrayal from his bloodline. He never married again after Rebecca's mother left. Died at 53. Heart attack, or so they said. She wondered now what else had been erased. Rebecca reached for her phone and tapped the contact labeled Aunt Janice. The call rang 4 times before the familiar rasp answered. "Becca? Hi, Aunt Jan. I need to ask you something. About Grandma Maggie." A long pause. She could hear the tension flood through the line like static. "Why now?" "I found something. A photo. It's her, after the Army said she was dead." More silence. Then, barely above a whisper, "I told your father we should have burned that letter too." By Rebecca closed her eyes. "Do you remember anything? Anything real? Not what the Army told you." "I remember your grandfather crying. First time I ever saw him do that. I was 12. Maggie was supposed to come home for Christmas. Instead, 2 men in uniform came to the door with a folder and a warning not to ask too many questions. Your dad took it the hardest. He worshipped her, thought she walked on water. After the letter he wouldn't speak her name, not once, not even at the funeral." Enter. There was a funeral. Closed casket. No flag, no honors. Just a pine box in the corner of the church. I don't think it even had her body in it. Rebecca's breath caught. "Do you still have anything of hers?" "No," Janice said softly. "After your dad came back from his first tour, he went through the attic and burned what little was left. Letters, medals, that nurse's cap she wore in training, all of it." The photo on the table seemed to pulse under the sunlight. "She wasn't a traitor," Rebecca said. "I don't think she ever was." "Well," Janice replied after a moment, "then you better find out who made the rest of us believe she was. And for it." That afternoon Rebecca drove to the local VFW post in Fayetteville. The place reeked of tobacco and old linoleum polish, but it was sacred ground to men who'd walked through hell and back. She entered carrying a small envelope with the photograph inside, heart pounding against her ribs like a warning drum. At the bar sat 3 veterans, old as driftwood, nursing beers and wearing caps embroidered with decades and wars. One of them, his eyes, pale blue, hair thin and snow-white, glanced up when she approached. "Afternoon, gentlemen," she said, nodding politely. "You lost?" the bartender asked. "Not exactly. I'm Captain Rebecca Hale, Army Medical Corps." The name turned a few heads. "I'm looking for anyone who served in North Africa. Medical units, infantry. Specifically 1,942. N." The white-haired man on the end shifted. 36th Infantry, he said. "Wasn't far from the med units during Operation Torch." Rebecca's pulse quickened. "Do you remember the 23rd Field Medical?" He narrowed his eyes. "Hell yes. They patched me up in Oran when shrapnel took my thigh." "Do you remember any of the nurses?" He hesitated. "Why?" "My grandmother served with them. Her name was Margaret Hale." The man's entire posture changed. His face tightened. The friendliness vanished, like someone cutting a switch. "Hale," he muttered. "You're her blood?" "I am." He stood, threw a 10 on the bar, and started toward the door. "Wait, please. I'm not here to defend her. I just want to know the truth." He turned sharply. "The truth?" "The truth is, she got good men killed. Gave the Krauts coordinates that led to a massacre. If she were alive, I'd spit at her feet." "That's not what the evidence says." "And if—" "I don't give a damn what your picture says," he snapped. "We lost 80. 2 men because of her. She fed 'em straight to the wolves." He pushed through the door, leaving Rebecca frozen. The others stared at her, somewhere between pity and contempt. The bartender leaned in. "You should go." Outside, the sky had turned gray, a storm teasing the horizon. Rebecca sat in her car, heart racing, hands trembling. The veteran's reaction hadn't been lukewarm, it was visceral. That wasn't gossip. That was trauma. But trauma doesn't mean truth. If Maggie had been so clearly guilty, why was her file still classified? Why the secrecy? Why the fake funeral and sealed records? She drove back to base and pulled up her father's military file. Marcus Hale, discharged honorably, Purple Heart. But there, in the margins of the file, she saw something strange. A note about psychological evaluation after a family legacy incident. She pulled the case number. The file was sealed, just like Maggie's. Someone had been watching the Hale family for a long time. End of chapter. That night, Rebecca met with Dr. Elizabeth Chen, her advisor and department head at the base medical school. If anyone understood bureaucracy and buried files, it was Chen. They sat in a quiet corner of a Thai restaurant near campus. Rebecca slid the photo across the table. Chen studied it for a long moment before speaking. "Where did you find this?" "Misfiled folder. Fort Liberty Archives." "Oh no. This is dangerous." "I know." "No," Chen said firmly, "you don't. Files sealed for 40 years are usually tied to operations that never officially existed. Black programs, intelligence work, deep cover missions. If Maggie Hale was OSS, this photo is evidence of something that was never supposed to be seen." Rebecca looked down. "She died, labeled a traitor." Chen's expression softened. "You're her granddaughter, and you wear the same uniform. They'll see you coming from a mile away." "Ho." "I'm not backing down." Chen leaned in. "Then be careful. People have spent decades making sure this story stays buried, and trust me, some of them are still alive." Rebecca left the meeting with a pit growing in her stomach. Later that night, she sat alone in her apartment, the lights off, her laptop glowing faint blue on the coffee table. She pulled up a map of North Africa, marking every location mentioned in the Allied operations of 1942. Then she pinned the photo to her wall beside the letter, two lies, side by side. If Maggie had been a spy, the Army couldn't afford to let it go public. And if she'd uncovered something darker, American officers trading secrets for money, lives sacrificed for profit, then silencing her would have been necessary to protect the system. Rebecca thought about the veteran's rage, the shame in her father's silence, the weight her family had carried for 4 generations. It wasn't just her story anymore. It was all of theirs. And she would not let it end in silence. She picked up a pen and wrote one line in the middle of her notebook. "Find the truth, even if it kills me." The sun was just starting to rise over Fort Liberty when Captain Rebecca Hale made her decision. She wouldn't wait for permission. She wouldn't file Freedom of Information requests and pray for someone at the Pentagon to suddenly care. She was going to break the rules. She was going to find out what the United States Army had spent 40 years trying to hide about her grandmother. And she was going to do it alone. Her phone buzzed. A message from Dr. Chen. "Be careful. If it starts to feel too easy, it means someone wants you to keep going. The wrong direction." Rebecca stared at the screen for a long time. Chen knew something. More than she was saying. But that wasn't surprising. Everyone knew something they weren't saying. And everyone who did seemed to end up dead, missing, or erased from history. She pulled on her uniform, clipped on her ID badge, and walked with purpose through the hallway toward the base intelligence archives. She knew the layout, knew the guards by name, knew the rotations and blind spots. After all, she'd worked in this building for 6 years. They trusted her. That trust was about to break. When the clerk at the front desk looked up, Rebecca gave her a tight smile. "Morning, Sergeant Ross. I need access to the digital record suite." "Clearance?" "Tier 2. Temporary authorization from Colonel Finch. It's for the North Africa Campaign File Review." He hesitated, tapped at his keyboard. "There's no note in the system." "Try the override code." She leaned in and spoke the sequence slowly, the way she'd memorized it from a classified training seminar 2 years ago. Ross's brows rose, but he entered the code. The screen blinked green. Okay. You're in 45 minutes. No phone, no external drives. You know the drill. Rebecca nodded. Of course. She passed through the security door and into a sealed room lined with terminals. A camera blinked above her head. She slid into the seat farthest from the door and pulled up the Army Personnel Archive. Margaret A. Hale, Dobb. 1,914. Enlistment. 1,940. 1 U.S. Army Nurse Corps. Assignment. 23rd Field Medical Unit, North Africa Theater. A prompt appeared. Classified, restricted by Order of Military Intelligence, 1,943. Access denied. Rebecca took a breath. Then she opened the back door system. It was old-patched years ago, but still accessible through a forgotten training module embedded in medical clearance records. From there, she bypassed the firewall and initiated a forced dump of linked content. It took 37 seconds. 37 seconds to retrieve a file sealed for 4 decades. She scrolled. Page after page of field reports, intercepted communiques, internal memos. The last entry was dated the 19th of October, 1942. Subject: Latine Margaret Hale. Suspicion of contact with hostile operatives in Jebel Messaoud sector. Observed departing with unknown individuals in non-American transport. Recommend immediate retrieval or neutralization. Field integrity compromised. Os liaison. My. R.F. Benedict. Neutralization. They hadn't planned to capture her. They'd planned to erase her. Rebecca's hands trembled as she printed the page and tucked it into her waistband. There were no cameras in this section. That was deliberate medical intelligence required privacy. But still, she moved fast. She had just finished logging out when the door opened. Colonel Dennis Finch stood in the doorway, arms folded. He didn't look surprised. I figured you'd show up here eventually. Rebecca stood, calm, but guarded. Good morning, sir. Oi. Mind telling me what you're looking for in sealed intelligence files from 1942? I could ask why you sealed them in the first place. Finch stepped inside, the door closing behind him. You have no idea what you're stepping into, Captain. I think I have a pretty good idea. No, you don't, Finch said flatly. You think this is about your grandmother, about some family wound you're finally ready to lance. But this isn't about Maggie Hale. It's about operations that never officially existed. About people who did what had to be done, even if it meant leaving behind inconvenient truths. She was your nurse. She treated your men. And when she uncovered something she wasn't supposed to see, you silenced her. She chose her fate, he said. She crossed a line. Number she crossed you. Finch stared at her for a long time. Then, to her surprise, he stepped aside. Go ahead, keep digging. But if you get burned, don't expect me to pull you out. She left without another word. And back in her apartment, Rebecca spread the contents of the printout on the table beside the photograph. The name Major R.F. Benedict caught her attention. OSS liaison, according to the file. She searched him next. Nothing came up. She tried the National Archives, the CIA declassified collection, even obituaries. Still nothing. Like he never existed. Or like someone had erased him too. Her laptop buzzed. An email, no sender, no subject. Just a single link. Rebecca hesitated. Then clicked. A grainy video began to play. An old man, seated in a dark room. Gray hair. Oxygen tube under his nose. Behind him, American flags and framed military medals on the wall. He looked directly at the camera. If you're watching this, it means I'm gone. Or they made sure I couldn't speak anymore. Rebecca leaned closer. My name is Richard Benedict. I was OSS liaison in the North Africa Theater. In 1942, I made a mistake. I told the truth to the wrong person. His voice cracked. I sent a Nurse Lieutenant Margaret Haleon an assignment to deliver coded medical manifests to a contact embedded within the German Medical Corps. We were feeding disinformation to the enemy to hide Allied troop movements. It was a decoy op. He coughed. But Maggie, she discovered it wasn't just disinformation. She found evidence of something far worse. American officers selling intel to German command for Swiss money. Not disinformation, not counterintelligence. Betrayal, real men, real bank accounts, real deaths. He paused. She transmitted a warning. Asked for extraction. She didn't make it out. She was captured, but not by Germans. Rebecca's stomach turned. She was intercepted by her own. Disavowed, labeled a traitor. I signed the order myself. Benedict looked into the camera. I was told it was for national security, that we couldn't risk exposing the others. But I've lived with her death for 40 years. She didn't deserve what we did to her. If you're watching this, please finish what she started. The screen went black. Rebecca stared at her reflection in the screen. Pale, hollow-eyed, jaw clenched. They killed her. Not the Germans, not the enemy, her own side. And they used the word traitor to clean their hands. That night, someone tried to break into her apartment. She heard it first, the soft click of metal. 3:12 a.m. She slipped out of bed and reached for her Beretta. Another click. Then the sound of a lock disengaging. The front door creaked. She moved fast, quietly, pressed against the hallway wall. A beam of light swept across the living room. Papers rustled. Someone was going through her table, searching for the photo, for the files. She waited until the figure was inches from the bedroom door, then stepped out. Stop right there. The intruder froze. Male, tall, black clothes, no insignia. Then he ran. Rebecca chased him through the living room, but he was gone before she reached the door. The wind from his escape still fluttered the blinds. He hadn't taken the original photo, was in the locked safe behind her closet. But all her notes were gone. All the printouts. Everything she'd left on the table. They knew she was close. They wanted her to stop, and they weren't going to ask again. By dawn, Rebecca sat in the back booth of a diner just outside the base perimeter. In front of her sat Walter Garrison. He looked like time had chipped away at him 1 year at a time. Wrinkled skin, shaking hands. But his eyes were still sharp. "You're Maggie's girl," he said, sipping his coffee. "She saved my life. Twice." Rebecca pulled out a second copy of the photo, the one she'd hidden in her car. "I think she died trying to stop something." OZ. Walter studied the image for a long time. His jaw clenched, his hands trembled. "She wasn't a traitor," he said. "But she did something worse. She asked the wrong questions, about the wrong men." He pulled out a scrap of paper. "Here. Last man she contacted. Frank Monroe. Used to be in OSS comms, still alive, but he won't be for long." Rebecca stared down at the name. "You think they'll come for him?" "They always do," Walter said. "This country's built on the bones of the inconvenient." He looked at her. "Are you ready to find out who your grandmother really was?" Rebecca didn't hesitate. "I already know." She tucked the paper into her pocket. As she stepped out into the fading daylight, she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't trust anyone in uniform anymore. Not even the ones who wore the same stars and stripes she did. Because whatever her grandmother had died for, whatever she had uncovered in the sands of North Africa, was still alive. And now it was watching her. The house stood just outside of Aberdeen, Maryland, a squat, weather-beaten rancher wrapped in rusting aluminum siding and decades of secrets. Overgrown weeds spilled across the cracked walkway. Wind chimes clinked nervously against one another as Captain Rebecca Hale stepped onto the porch. She checked the note Walter Garrison had given her again. "Franklin Monroe, 206 Hollow Creek Drive, Ive. Knock twice, then once. Don't mention OSS until you're inside. M." She took a breath, then knocked. Twice, then once. Silence. A shadow shifted behind the curtain. The deadbolt clicked. The door creaked open. And there he stood. Franklin Monroe was a man aged like driftwood bleached, worn but not broken. His eyes were fogged by time, but still studied her with the precision of a man who'd once counted seconds between detonations. "You're not CIA," he said. "No, sir." "Good." He opened the door wider. "Then come in before they decide to watch again." Rebecca stepped inside. The air smelled like old paper and rain-soaked wood. Piles of files were stacked along every wall, mismatched boxes, handwritten notes, yellowed photographs paper-clipped into loose folders. The only light came from a green-shaded banker's lamp perched on a dusty desk. "You're here about Maggie," he said flatly. Rebecca didn't answer. She didn't have to. He nodded toward the couch. "Sit. You're going to need it." End of 20. She lowered herself onto the squeaky springs and pulled the black and white photo from her bag. "I found this in a misfiled military record. My grandmother—" "Margaret Hale," he interrupted. "I know who she was. I knew her." Rebecca blinked. "You knew her?" "I worked with her. She was part of Operation Harvest." He paused, gouging hair reaction. "You don't know what that is, do you?" "Number." "That's the point. He turned, opened a tin box from a locked drawer, and withdrew a thin dossier, labeled 1942, Dennied, redacted. He dropped it onto the table like a curse. It was one of the darkest, covert exchanges of the war, a false flag intelligence campaign designed to confuse both the Axis and Allied Forceso High Command could quietly remove undesirables. Rebecca leaned forward. "What do you mean, undesirables?" "I mean officers who had gotten too close to truths no one wanted revealed. Journalists, field doctors, even priests. Anyone who knew what couldn't be written down." He flipped open the file. Inside were 6 names. Maggie's was the 5th. She was our medic, but she wasn't just patching wounds. She was also running counter-surveillance for Benedict. Rebecca nodded. "I found a video. A confession. He said she uncovered corruption. Officers selling intel for cash." Franklin laughed bitterly. "It was worse than that. They weren't just selling secrets. They were trading people. Entire units. Letting troops walk into slaughter so they could negotiate more leverage with the enemy. One American battalion walked into a trap in El Getar because of a falsified map that came directly from within." His voice trembled. "My brother was in that unit." Silence filled the room. Rebecca stared at the folder. "She tried to expose it," Franklin said. "She sent coded messages using surgical report logs to mask her intel. But they caught on. Benedict tried to protect her, but by then it was too late. The operation had grown too big to fail. They made her the fall." "She was captured," Rebecca whispered. "But not by the enemy." Franklin nodded. "She knew the rules. She knew what would happen, but she did it anyway." He stood and walked to a bookcase, pulled out a faded envelope. "This is the last thing she wrote before she disappeared. She slipped it to me during a night shift." Rebecca carefully opened the brittle paper. The handwriting was tight and sharp. She read aloud, "To whoever finds this, they're coming for me. But not because I lied. Because I told the truth. And the truth in this war is the most dangerous thing you can carry. If you ever get the chance, finish what I couldn't. M.H." Rebecca closed her eyes. She had never felt closer to her grandmother, or farther from the institution they both served. Franklin poured 2 fingers of bourbon into a chipped glass and handed it to her. "You look like you need something to burn away what comes next." She took the glass, but didn't drink. "Why didn't you speak up?" "I did," he said quietly. "They burned my clearance, froze my pension, labeled me unstable. I lost my wife, my daughter. I spent 40 years shouting into a void. And He looked at her, eyes glassy but fierce. "They erased her, but I didn't forget. I never forgot." He placed a hand on her shoulder. "She wasn't a stain, Rebecca. She was a spark. And the only reason they killed her is because she burned too bright." Rebecca finally drank. It scorched her throat. But the truth in his words burned deeper. The next morning Rebecca returned to Fort Liberty with 2 missions. Find out who had authorized the original cover-up, and find out who was still protecting it. She went to the JAG archives, the military's legal nerve center. She posed as a graduate student studying WWII military law. It wasn't entirely untrue. The clerk led her to a microfiche archive of sealed trials and tribunal reviews from the North Africa theater. She scanned until her eyes blurred. Then she found it. Case 217b. Margaret Hale. Except it wasn't a trial. It was a memo. Subject determined to be liability to active operations. Recommend preemptive removal to preserve intelligence continuity. Signed, Colonel J. Mercer. Rebecca froze. Julian Mercer. The name meant nothing to her. But her father had spoken of him once. "I served with a Mercer in Vietnam," he'd said on a rare drunk night. "Sharp shooter, snake in the grass. The kind of man who never left blood on his boots." She pulled up Mercer's file. Decorated career. Multiple theaters. OSS connections. Retired in 1979. Died in 2001. Too late for justice. But maybe not too late for exposure. Rebecca took a deep breath. She wasn't just chasing names anymore. She was chasing a system. And she wasn't alone. She returned to Franklin's that night. His porch light was off. Her heart sank. She knocked. Nothing. She called. No answer. Then she saw the note, taped to the inside of his front window. "They know you were here. Don't come back. Run if you want to live." Rebecca stepped back, heart pounding. A black SUV idled down the street. Headlights off. No license plate. She turned and walked calmly to her car. Got in. Locked the doors. She didn't start the engine. Not yet. She stared into the rearview mirror. The SUV never moved. But she knew. They were watching. Just like they'd watched Maggie. Just like they'd waited. And now it was happening again. History wasn't just repeating. It was finishing what it started. And back in her apartment, Rebecca opened Maggie's letter again. "If you ever get the chance, finish what I couldn't." She pulled out a map of North Africa. Marked every location linked to Operation Harvest. She found one name that kept repeating. Bir el Abid. A ruined outpost. Long abandoned. She cross-checked it against declassified mission logs. Then froze. Because one name kept appearing alongside Maggie's in every record tied to that location. Julian Mercer. He hadn't just signed her execution memo. He had been there. In the same room. The same unit. The same sand. He'd buried her literally or figuratively. And if anyone knew the full truth, it had been him. Which meant the people protecting that truth were still here. And they still had something to lose. Rebecca stared at the warboard in her living room. Photos. Names. Dossier. A tangled web of red thread stretching across time and treachery. In the center of it all, Maggie Hale. Not a traitor. A witness. A whistleblower. A woman whose courage had outlived the silence they tried to drown her in. Rebecca stepped back. She picked up a marker. And on the edge of the board, in capital letters, she wrote, "They didn't forget. They just pretended to. But I remember." She capped the marker, looked at the last photo of Maggie, and whispered, "They're not going to win this time." The desert outpost of Bir el Abid had vanished from most modern maps. Once a dusty refueling station during the North African campaign, it had long since crumbled into sand. No road signs, no markers. Just coordinates and a name. Rebecca stared at the satellite image glowing on her laptop. The location had appeared again and again in her grandmother's file, in Operation Harvest reports, and in Franklin Monroe's annotated maps. It was the last place Maggie had been seen alive. And it was the one place Rebecca couldn't ignore. She circled it in red. 3 names were pinned around it. Margaret Hale, Julian Mercer, Benedict. She'd crossed off Benedict dead. Mercer was next. Though the official record said he died in 2001, Rebecca had learned enough not to trust official records, especially when they were written by the same hands that had tried to erase her grandmother. She opened her father's old photo album. Most of it had been gutted years ago, but one page remained. A blurry group photo from his Vietnam tour. 8 men, young, smiling, sunburned and proud. On the far right stood a man with sharp eyes, pale skin, and a scar on his temple. In marker beneath it, Colonel J. Mercer, ghost with a badge. Her father had hated him. She scanned the photo, uploaded it to a facial recognition engine built for internal DoD use. It wasn't legal, but she didn't care. It took 12 seconds. Match found. Julian Mercer, alias John Marcus Riedel. Location, Brooksville, Florida. Status, private security consultant, retired. Alive. Rebecca felt her skin crawl. The house was tucked beneath Spanish moss and oak trees, one of those Florida homes that seem to hide from time. The driveway was overgrown. A plastic American flag hung limp above the porch. A dog barked hoarsely in the distance. Rebecca approached cautiously, her ID badge tucked away, her weapon holstered. She knocked once. Silence. Then footsteps. Julian Mercer answered the door in a white undershirt, khakis, and slippers. At 92, he looked like a man chiseled from granite, barely softened by age. His eyes narrowed the moment he saw her. "You're Maggie's girl." Rebecca froze. He hadn't even asked who she was. "You look like her," he said, "only taller." He stepped aside. "If you came for the truth, you're 40 years too late." Say. She stepped into a home frozen in time, military plaques on the walls, shelves lined with books about covert warfare, and a faint scent of pipe tobacco in the air. Rebecca sat on the couch. Mercer remained standing, looming like an unspoken threat. "I'm not here to accuse you," she said. "Yes, you are," he replied. "And that's fine, you should." He limped to the bar cart and poured bourbon into a chipped glass. "But understand, this word doesn't make truth. It makes stories that survive long enough to be called truth. You signed the order to have her removed." "I did." "Why?" He stared at his glass. "Because she saw something I couldn't allow to surface." Rebecca held up the photo. "You were in the background of this." He nodded. "That was the day everything fell apart." He sat down. "She wasn't supposed to be on that convoy. It was a black transfer, no names, no uniforms. We were moving prisoners, most of them double agentsmen we'd flipped. Maggie had been treating one of them. She suspected we were planning executions, not trials. She was right, wasn't she?" "Yes." Rebecca leaned forward. "Why?" "Because trials leave trails. Witnesses, journalists, paperwork. But bullets and sand?" He shrugged. "They don't talk." "You buried her because she wouldn't let it go." "I didn't bury her," Mercer said flatly. "I gave the order to extract and isolate her. But Benedict disobeyed. He tried to smuggle her out. They got caught. After that, the decision was made for me." He stood again, suddenly agitated. "There were men in that operation whose names still sit in Pentagon directories. Some of them are senators now, CEOs. You don't get to take them down with a nurse's conscience." "She wasn't just a nurse," Rebecca said. "She was your liability." Mercer laughed bitterly. "She was the only honest one among us, and she paid the price." End of chapter. Rebecca stood too, her hands clenched. "So now what?" she asked. "You just wait to die, hoping no one knocks on your door?" He didn't answer. But he walked to a drawer and retrieved a folded map. It was old, frayed at the edges, annotated in red and black ink. He laid it on the table. "This is where we took her," he said, pointing to a barren stretch of Algerian desert. Bir el Abid? Number 30 clicks west. A dry basin used for weapons tests. We called it Echo Point. There was a bunker there. No insignia. No records. That's where they kept people who couldn't be seen. He circled it with trembling fingers. "That's where she died." Rebecca stared at the mark. It was almost nothing, a dot in a sea of forgotten sand. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I see it in your eyes," he said. "You're going to go, no matter what I say." "I am." He nodded. "Then go prepared, and don't go alone. M." That night, Rebecca drove to a nearby storage facility, unlocked her father's old unit, and retrieved a weathered duffel marked H. Marcus. Inside, his field gear, a Beretta M9, 2 full mags, a flak vest, and a black journal. She flipped it open. Page 1. Things I couldn't tell anyone. It was filled with entries short, clipped, furious. Stories of Vietnam, corruption, threats. Mentions of a Mercer and something called Protocol Indigo. Then, toward the end, I saw a letter once. A letter from a man in Washington. He said, "If Maggie Hale ever resurfaces, activate Indigo." I don't know what Indigo is, but I know it starts with silence and ends with burial. Rebecca swallowed hard. She copied the line onto her notebook. Protocol Indigo. Find what it means. Find who activates it. The next morning, Rebecca met with Dr. Chen again. They sat in the back of a chapel on base, far from microphones, far from watchers. She handed Chen the map. And the note about Indigo. Chen paled. "I've heard whispers of that protocol," she said, "buried in Cold War intel meetings, never written down. But the rumor was always the same. Indigo isn't defense. Indigo is deletion." Rebecca nodded. "I think my grandmother triggered it, and now I might have too." "You can't keep going," Chen said. "They'll come for you." "They already have." Chen looked at her for a long time, then slid a key across the bench. "Safe house. Outside Durham. Unlisted. You have 72 hours before the audit team comes back to this base. After that, you won't be able to breathe without them knowing." Rebecca closed her fingers over the key. "I won't let them win." "Neither did she," Chen said quietly. "That's what scared them." End of quote. That night, in the quiet of the safe house, Rebecca pinned the map to the wall. She traced the route from Iran to Echo Point. She calculated the time it would have taken. The report said Maggie vanished on the 19th of October, 1942. Rebecca noticed something strange. A line on the map labeled Opal Line. She cross-referenced it. Opal Line was an Allied supply route, but only used for 2 days, the 18th of October and 19. Then it vanished from logs. She opened the box of materials Franklin Monroe had given her. Inside, a torn corner of a manifest from 1942. Opal Convoy. 14 crates, 3 personnel. Authorization, J. Mercer. Rebecca froze. 14 crates. 3 personnel. One of them was her grandmother. The manifest was dated the 19th of October, 1942. The same day Maggie vanished. It hadn't been a transfer. It had been a disappearance dressed as logistics. And Maggie had been cargo. Rebecca's final entry that night was written with shaking hands. The map was never meant to lead to her. The name was never supposed to be remembered. And the lie was supposed to live forever. But not anymore. Echo Point waits. She folded the map, packed her bag, and headed for the airport. The flight into Algiers was quiet. The desert stretched out beneath the clouds like a sleeping animal vast, unknowable, and waiting. Rebecca sat by the window, the crumpled map clenched in her fist. Echo Point wasn't listed on any official chart. Not anymore. But she had the coordinates, and the silence to guide her. She didn't tell anyone where she was going. Not even Dr. Shen. Not even Walter. Because if this place was real, if her grandmother had really died out there then, Rebecca couldn't risk someone warning the people who still wanted that truth buried. At customs, she gave a false name, Sarah Marcus. A nod to the alias Mercer had used in Florida. It felt right. Like she was borrowing a piece of the enemy to undo what he'd built. By the time she reached the edge of the Ahagar Mountains, it was dusk. The heat didn't fade with the sun. It clung to her skin like regret. She hired a local driver, an old man with more scars than teeth to take her as far as the road would go. "Where you go," he said in broken French. "Road ends. Ghosts begin." She didn't correct him. He was right. 25. They stopped at a crumbling gas station with sand swallowing its pumps. From there she hiked. Alone. 3 days. Just her pack, her Beretta, and the voice of her grandmother echoing inside her. The terrain grew more jagged, more hostile. Wind whipped between rock formations like whispered warnings, and on the fourth morning, as the sun bled red across the cliffs, she saw it, Echo Point, or what was left of it. A shallow basin carved into the earth. Concrete bunkers cracked open like eggshells. Corrugated steel peeled back by time. The bones of a forgotten war still jutting from the sand. Rebecca crouched at the edge of the basin and scanned the landscape. No movement, no sound, just the wind and the ghosts. She climbed down slowly. Inside the largest bunker, she found remnants of a command station, rusted cot frames, a broken radio, and faded stencils on the wall most illegible. But one stood out. Protocol Indigo activated, 19 OCT, 1942. Her pulse quickened. This was the place. She ran her fingers across the cold wall, then deeper into the structure. That's when she saw it. A chain bolted into the concrete, long, rusted, meant for something or someone held down. Next to it a rusted metal tray with rotted cloth straps. A stretcher. She crouched. On the wall above it, someone had etched into the stone with what looked like a nail. Not words. Just 3 letters. M.H. Rebecca's chest tightened. Her hand trembled as she brushed the sand from the floor beneath the chain. More etchings. Coordinates. A date and a word. North. Mercy. She took a photo. Marked the coordinates. And then she heard it. Footsteps. Boots. More than one pair. Her heart dropped. She ducked behind a rusted metal cabinet just as 2 men entered. One was local thin, tense, wearing desert gear. The other American, tall, clean haircut, tactical boots. Radio clipped to his vest. Place is dead, the American said. Still fresh footprints, the other replied in Arabic. The American knelt. Someone's been here in the last 24 hours. The local crouched near the chain. She was real, he muttered. Yeah. And now someone wants to make her real again. That's a problem. They turned and walked deeper into the bunker. Rebecca didn't wait. She slipped out through a back tunnel and crawled beneath collapsed beams until she found an air duct that led back to the surface. Her heart pounded. They'd followed her, which meant Protocol Indigo wasn't dead. It had been sleeping, and now it was awake again. Section. That night, she camped in a crevice beneath the rocks and studied the new coordinates she'd found, 9 kilometers north. Near an old French missionary station listed on colonial maps as Maison de Miséricorde, House of Mercy. North. Mercy. Madge's final message. Rebecca packed at dawn and moved quickly. No fire, no noise. By midday she reached the ridge. Below, half buried in the sand, was a stone chapel. Collapsed roof, iron bell tower torn down by time, but the symbol above the door was unmistakable. Red Cross. She stepped inside. Silence. Dust. And then a sound. Metal dragging against stone. She turned, gun raised. A figure stepped from the shadows. An old woman, bent, with a veil covering her face and a rosary wrapped around her fingers. She spoke softly in French. You are the granddaughter. Rebecca didn't respond. The woman smiled. She said you would come. Rebecca lowered the weapon. Who are you? Someone who remembers. The woman turned and walked deeper into the chapel. Rebecca followed. Behind the altar, a stairwell descended into the earth, lit by flickering candles. At the bottom, a door, and behind it, preserved by dry air and darkness, was a small room. A cot. A desk. A roasted fork stand. And on the wall, photographs, dozens of them, pinned with care. Maggie, in uniform, with soldiers, with villagers, smiling, weeping, alive. Rebecca stared, tears in her eyes. She didn't die here, did she? The woman shook her head. She was brought here after the basin left to die, but we found her. The sisters took her in. She lived for 10 more years. Rebecca swallowed. Why didn't she come home? She tried, but the people who buried her name still watched. She knew they would hurt those she loved, so she stayed quiet until the cancer came. The woman handed Rebecca a box. Inside, letters. Unsent. All addressed to my dearest Rebecca. Rebecca opened one. I dream of you often. You were just a baby when I saw your photograph last. If I could give you one gift, it would be this. Never let the silence win. Speak louder than the grave they put me in. Rebecca's hands shook. How did she die? In this room, the woman said, with her boots at the door and her country on her lips. Rebecca sat on the cot. Tears ran down her cheeks. She was never a traitor. No, the woman said. She was the last good thing they couldn't control. Aratin. Rebecca returned to the chapel 2 more times that week, collected every letter, every photo, every trace of Maggie that survived. She buried a Pendanta family heirloom beneath the altar, a promise left behind. On the final day, she returned to Echo Point. Alone. She stood in the basin and shouted into the wind, "You failed." The silence swallowed her words. But in her heart, she knew Maggie had heard. Back in the U.S., Rebecca sent a file to Dr. Chen. Inside, Mercer's map, Maggie's letters, a video confession from the chapel caretaker, photos of Echo Point, coordinates. The final letter, scanned and transcribed. She attached one line. Make it public. If I disappear, make sure her name doesn't. Dr. Chen's reply came 1 hour later. Already in motion. The grave is open. The moment Rebecca Hale's boots touched American soil again, the air felt different. Not just heavier. Watched. As if something old and poisonous had followed her across the Atlantic, hidden in her shadow. She didn't go home. Didn't check her phone. Instead, she drove straight to a storage facility in Northern Virginia, a unit left to her in Walter Garrison's will, sealed and coded, never mentioned until after his death. He'd called it insurance. Inside, beneath a tarp and 2 rusted footlockers, she found a single manila folder. Indigo files. Do not duplicate. It was stamped multiple times with classified, eyes only, executive restriction. Rebecca opened it. The pages inside weren't just files. They were blueprints. For a program, for a doctrine, for a lie. Protocol Indigo. Internal Directive 1942. Objective. Silence any breach of black operations in wartime theaters. Method. Discredit, detain, or eliminate non-compliant personnel. Classification level. Indigo 5. No paper trail. Oversight. Office of Strategic Continuity, Department of Defense, indirect. Targets. Hale, Margaret, neutralized. Monroe, Franklin, discredited. Benedict, alias deceased. H. Marcus, deceased. Ale, Rebecca, flagged, active risk. Her name. On a government kill list. Active. Rebecca exhaled through her teeth. So this wasn't over. It had only just begun. She spent the next 36 hours buried in the file. It wasn't just an internal operation, it was a network. A decentralized system designed to erase truths that couldn't be contained with legal frameworks. It began in WWII but had evolved or shaped for Vietnam, repurposed during the Cold War, and still active during the Gulf War. Each generation had added new code names, new suppression tools. Project Cinder. Operation Soft Light. Domestic Containment Act, unratified but enforced. And, woven through all of them, Indigo Protocol, a common thread. One doctrine. One silent war. Rebecca circled the 5 names in the 1984 entry of the files. All dead, all neutralized in some fashion. Except one. Gerald Knox. Title: Civilian Liaison Officer, Pentagon Records Division. Location: Washington, D.C. Status: inactive. She ran a deep pull through the military archives. Found an address. Knox lived in a brownstone off DuPont Circle. The kind of man who once walked halls of power, but now had curtains drawn at noon and 3 locks on every door. Rebecca knocked. When he opened it, he was holding a revolver in one hand and a glass of Ensure in the other. I figured you'd come eventually, he rasped. I'm not them, Rebecca said. Number? But they'll follow you here. I don't care. Knox considered her for a beat, then stepped aside. Then hurry. His apartment smelled like iodine and resignation. Every surface was covered in papers, clippings, annotated red lines, VHS tapes with military stamps. On the table sat a dusty tape recorder labeled Indigo Benetic Confession 1973. Knox pointed to it. Everything they did to Maggie Hale is in there, but you play it, you don't stop. Rebecca pressed play. A man's voice tired, hollow. My name is Elias Benedict, former OSS. I am recording this for history because I don't believe we'll live long enough to write it. He paused. Indigo was designed to protect America from collapse. That's what they told us. But what it really did was protect the rot, the corruption. They didn't silence traitors. They silenced truth-tellers. People like Maggie Hale. People like me. The tape hissed. They broke us into teams. One ran media cover. One ran discrediting campaigns. One did final solutions. I was in the last group, until Maggie. Another pause. She saved a boy an Algerian translator. He'd overheard Mercer and two others planning a friendly fire incident for leverage. She pulled him out, got him to me. And that's when I knew we weren't the good guys anymore. Click. The tape shut off. Rebecca stared at it, unable to breathe. Knox stood beside her, his hands trembling. We tried to stop it in '74. Congressional hearing. It got shut down before the second gavel. They called it a procedural review of wartime ethics. He pointed to a manila folder labeled Internal Threats, Eyes Only. Oh, quote. Inside that is a list of every person who signed off on Indigo from 1940 to 2005. You leak that you become public enemy number one. Rebecca didn't blink. Then I guess it's time someone did. That night she uploaded all 187 pages of the Indigo files to an encrypted archive in Iceland. She attached timestamps, photos, video from Echo Point, and Maggie's letters. Then she wrote an open letter. My name is Captain Rebecca Hale. I am a serving officer in the United States Army. My grandmother, Margaret Hale, was executed in silence by an illegal protocol that still exists today. I am not leaking this to shame my country. I am doing it to heal it. If they silence me too, then let my silence speak louder than their lies ever could. She hit send, and waited. Within 24 hours it was global. CNN ran it as a whistleblower report with historic implications. The Guardian called it the file that should never have survived. Thousands of veterans wrote in with memories, with photos, with stories of men and women who had vanished, who had been reassigned, and never heard from again. One message stood out. My aunt served with Maggie Hale. We thought she died in Tunisia. Now I know the truth. Thank you, Eleanor Jota. But the silence wasn't gone. At 3:12 a.m., Rebecca's apartment was broken into. Her computer was wiped. Her physical archive destroyed. But it didn't matter. The world already had it. And Protocol Indigo could no longer hide in the dark. 2 days later, she stood in front of a subcommittee in Congress, testifying, calm, composed, deadly. Senator Alicia Monroe, one of the few willing to speak on record, asked the final question, Captain Hale, in your opinion, what was Protocol Indigo designed to do? Rebecca stared straight ahead. To protect the myth that America has never failed, even if it meant killing those who proved otherwise. Gasps filled the chamber. She didn't flinch, didn't blink. That night, Knox called her. They'll try to spin it, water it down, say it was a relic, but it's a start. Rebecca stood by the window of her temporary safe house, watching a storm roll in. They said she was a traitor, she whispered, and now they have to say her name. They will, Knox said, because you made them. She looked down at the medal Maggie had once received, still in its box, tarnished with time. She deserves more than a medal. End quote. She'll get it. The final scene of the chapter takes place in Arlington. A small, quiet ceremony. No cameras. Just Rebecca, Dr. Chen, a handful of surviving nurses from WWII, and a new gravestone, Major Margaret Hale, 1917, 1982. She told the truth. They buried her. We uncovered her. Rebecca placed a photograph beside the grave. It was the last one Maggie had taken at the chapel in Algeria. She was smiling. Alive. Free. It was supposed to be over. After the hearings, after the files went public, after Maggie Hale's name was finally etched in stone with the honor she was denied for decades, Rebecca thought maybe, just maybe, silence would no longer win. But she was wrong, because the moment truth becomes visible, the war changes shape. They didn't call it indigo anymore. They called it oversight restructuring, classified reevaluation, non-traditional threat mitigation. Same doctrine, new words, different uniforms. But the objective remained: protect the myth, eliminate the contradiction. Rebecca knew that the first war buried her grandmother, and the second war, it had already begun with her. And one morning, a week after the ceremony at Arlington, Rebecca found a white envelope taped to her windshield. No return address. Inside, a photo. Her apartment, taken from across the street. The timestamp read 3:14 a.m. She lived alone. The message on the back was scrawled in pencil. History doesn't stop with you, neither do we. Rebecca didn't report it. Didn't go to base security. She just burned it in the sink and opened a new notebook. On the first page she wrote, "They watched Maggie. Now they watch me. So I'll give them something worth watching." And on. Rebecca didn't run. She embedded herself inside the machine, accepted a reassignment to the Defense Historical Review Board, obscure, underfunded office. No one watched too closely. And from there she began building something Maggie never could. A new archive. Unredacted. Backed by first-hand testimony, satellite imagery, leaked internal memos, and letters mailed in brown envelopes from strangers who knew too much and trusted too few. She called it the Witness Vault. Its first upload? Maggie's journal. Scanned. Preserved. Public. But it didn't stop there. Names followed. Cases reopened. Families contacted. Burials revisited. And with each record uploaded, the silence cracked a little more, until it began to echo. Out or two. They came for her again in the spring. This time it wasn't a photo. It was a fabricated disciplinary report alleging emotional instability and potential breaches of protocol. Anonymous complaint. Filed on the same day, she published the Indigo Chain of Command chart. But Rebecca was ready. She called a press conference. Live streamed. Uniform pressed. Voice steady. She stood at the podium and said, "When my grandmother died, they said nothing. When I found the truth, they said I was unstable. If telling the truth makes me a threat, then maybe the threat isn't me." It went viral. Again. They backed off her now. But she knew better. The machine doesn't stop. It just recalibrates. The Frume. On the one-year anniversary of her testimony, Rebecca returned to Algeria. She hiked to the ruined chapel where Maggie had died in peace. This time, she wasn't alone. A group of women followed. Historians. Daughters of nurses. Sons of translators who'd vanished in 1942 and never came home. Together, they planted a plaque beside the altar. Echo Point remembers. For those who spoke and were buried, may your names rise like dust in sunlight. Rebecca knelt at the stone, closed her eyes, and for the first time she heard it not silence. Not wind, not ghosts, but the voice of legacy. Not just Maggie's, her own, Hez. In her final journal entry that year, she wrote, "The war for truth is not fought in trenches or in courts. It is fought in memory, in the stories they tried to burn, in the names they tried to erase. Maggie Hale was my blood, but she is also America's spine, bent, but never broken." Rebecca closed the journal and turned off the light, but outside the world kept watching. And this time, she watched it back.